You missed the spot, Maid. Richard Whitmore's voice cut through the ballroom like shattered glass. The string quartet stumbled for half a second before recovering, but the damage was done. Conversation slowed. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm gold light across tuxedos and diamonds while nearly 200 guests turned toward the black woman standing beside the champagne tower. Evelyn Brooks did not move. Her white gloves stayed folded neatly at her waist, though one finger tightened ever so slightly against the fabric. Richard lifted his stained suit jacket, champagne dripping slowly from the sleeve onto polished marble. Or is basic cleaning too difficult now? A few guests laughed under their breath. Not loud. Just enough. The kind of laughter people used when someone powerful had already decided who mattered in the room. Evelyn lowered her eyes for exactly 1 second. Not shame. Calculation. I apologize, sir, she said quietly. Her voice stayed calm, soft enough to disappear under the hum of violin strings and expensive conversation. Richard gave a satisfied nod, already turning back toward the investors gathered around him. Men worth hundreds of millions. A senator near the fountain. Tech founders with practiced smiles. Everyone important. Everyone watching. People like her, Richard said, adjusting his cufflinks, should stay invisible. More laughter this time. Someone raised a champagne glass. Someone else smirked. Near the back of the room, a young waiter looked down awkwardly. Evelyn stood perfectly still while heat from the ballroom lights settled across her skin. The scent of expensive perfume and whiskey floated through the air. Somewhere near the kitchen doors, silver trays clattered softly. She should have walked away. Most people would have. But something shifted in her expression. Small. Almost impossible to notice. The kind of stillness that came before weather changed. Richard turned toward a cluster of executives standing near a glowing presentation screen. A massive merger announcement sat frozen across the display. Whitmore Technologies. A deal so large reporters had called it the biggest corporate move of the year. Richard smiled. Wider now, comfortable again, basking in admiration. Tomorrow morning, he said confidently. We finalize everything. Evelyn's gaze flicked toward the screen. Just for a moment. Long enough to catch a line item buried inside projected numbers. Her eyes narrowed. Barely. Then she stepped closer. One quiet step against marble. Richard sensed movement and frowned instantly. What now? He muttered. Guests nearby leaned in. Curious. Waiting for another embarrassment. Evelyn kept her posture straight. Calm. Controlled. Sir, she said softly, you may want to delay tomorrow's signing. Silence. Even the music suddenly felt farther away. Richard blinked once. Then laughed. Hard. Excuse me? Evelyn's eyes moved briefly toward the numbers glowing blue against the wall. The dead exposure inside that merger, she said carefully. Something does not look right. A woman beside Richard scoffed openly. Did the maid just give financial advice? More laughter rippled through the crowd. Richard shook his head slowly, amused now. Dangerous amusement. You clean tables, he said. I build companies. Evelyn nodded once, accepting the humiliation without protest. But she did not step back. Then maybe, she said quietly, you should ask why your projected earnings disappear in Q3. Richard's smile disappeared. Not fully. Just enough. Somewhere behind him, one executive stopped mid-sip. Another looked toward the screen. Richard folded his arms slowly. Who exactly do you think you are? He asked. Evelyn glanced once at the merger presentation again. Her voice dropped lower now, calm enough to unsettle the room. Someone who has seen this exact mistake before. Richard stared at her for a long moment, irritation tightening his jaw. Then he motioned sharply toward security near the entrance. Get her out of here. The ballroom exhaled. A collective release. The humiliation complete. But as security approached, one older investor standing near the screen suddenly frowned, leaned closer to the financial projections, and quietly whispered, Richard, Why is Q3 missing $40 million? The ballroom shifted. Slowly at first. Then all at once. Richard. Whitmore's smile tightened as the older investor stepped closer to the glowing presentation screen, squinting beneath the cold blue light. Richard, he said again, quieter this time. Why is Q3 missing $40 million? The laughter vanished. Crystal glasses lowered. Somewhere near the back, a champagne bottle hissed open, absurdly loud against the sudden silence. Richard turned sharply toward the screen. That is impossible, he said too fast. His voice landed harder than he meant it to. The executive beside him reached for a tablet, fingers moving quickly, jaw tightening with every swipe. Evelyn stood near the ballroom doors now, security lingering awkwardly at her side. Neither guard touched her. Not anymore. She simply waited, posture calm, white gloves folded neatly in front of her. Richard glanced at her once. Just once. Then looked away. Run the numbers, he snapped. Now. The giant ballroom suddenly felt smaller. Hotter. Tighter. Expensive perfume mixed with the sharp scent of stress. Investors exchanged looks. Quiet whispers moved through the room like smoke. One woman slowly lowered her wine glass. I thought this was fully vetted, she murmured. Richard ignored her. His polished shoes clicked sharply against marble as he stepped closer to the display. There is no missing money, he said through clenched teeth. This merger has been reviewed 6 times. But his voice had lost something. Confidence. The executive holding the tablet swallowed hard. Sir? He hesitated. Bad sign. Richard's stare hardened. What? The man looked pale now, thumb frozen against the screen. There is a deferred liability package buried in Q3. Silence. Thick. Immediate. Someone behind them whispered. No way. Another investor quietly stepped back from the crowd. Richard's chest rose slowly. Once. Twice. The room felt suddenly too warm against his skin. How much? He asked. Nobody answered right away. Then came the number. 43.8 million. The air changed. It was subtle, but everyone felt it. Respect shifting. Power wobbling. Eyes moving away from Richard and slowly, carefully, toward Evelyn. Richard turned to look at her. Again. Really look this time. She had not moved. Not a trace of satisfaction crossed her face. No arrogance. No revenge. Just stillness. You knew, he said quietly. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. I suspected. Richard let out a short laugh, humorless this time. You suspected? His voice sharpened again, defensive now. You are a hotel maid. Several guests looked uncomfortable. One investor frowned openly. The sentence landed differently now. Smaller. Meaner. Evelyn's gaze stayed steady. Titles do not stop numbers from telling the truth. Richard's jaw flexed. Around him, pressure mounted. Phones buzzed. Investors whispered urgently. The senator quietly slipped toward the exit. One board member muttered under his breath. If this leaks before tomorrow. Richard rubbed a hand across his face, suddenly aware of sweat gathering beneath his collar. The ballroom lights felt too bright. Too exposing. Then the executive with the tablet spoke again, voice shaking slightly. Sir? Richard looked up. What now? The man swallowed. There is something else. He turned the screen slightly so only Richard could see it. Richard's expression changed instantly. Confusion first. Then disbelief. Then something dangerously close to fear. His eyes flicked toward Evelyn again. Slower this time. Who? He stopped himself. Tried again. Who are you? Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, the noise of the ballroom fading around them until only the hum of air conditioning and distant violin strings remained. Then, quietly, almost gently, she said, Asked your father? Richard froze. Completely. Because his father had been dead for 11 years. Richard Whitmore did not blink. Not right away. The ballroom noise faded into something distant and hollow, like sound trapped underwater. My father? He repeated quietly. Around them, phones shifted upward. Tiny camera lights blinked on. Investors stopped pretending not to stare. Evelyn stood near the ballroom doors, warm chandelier light brushing the silver strands near her temple, posture calm enough to feel dangerous. Richard swallowed once. Hard. You knew my father? He asked, but the sharp edge in his voice had dulled. Not softer. Worse. Unsteady. Evelyn glanced briefly toward the giant merger screen where $43.8 million still glowed like an accusation. Very well, she said. The room tightened again. Someone whispered, Who is she? Richard stepped closer, polished shoes striking marble too loudly now. No, he said quickly, lowering his voice. If this is some kind of stunt. His sentence died halfway through. Because Evelyn had already turned slightly toward one of the framed black and white photographs hanging beside the gala entrance. Richard's late father. Henry Whitmore. Smiling beside a factory floor. He hated expensive watches, Evelyn said quietly. Said they made men forget time mattered. Richard froze. His father used to say that. Constantly. Never in interviews. Never publicly. A private joke. His chest tightened. How would you know that? Evelyn did not answer immediately. Instead, her eyes moved across the room. Investors whispering now. Executives checking numbers again. One board member already sweating through his collar. 20 years ago, she said carefully, your father almost lost everything. Richard's expression darkened instantly. That never happened. Reflex. Defense. Family mythology. Whitmore's success was legendary. Untouchable. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. That is what he told people. Silence. Somewhere near the kitchen, a tray hit the floor with a metallic crash. Nobody turned. Nobody cared. Richard looked suddenly irritated again, desperate to regain control. Enough, he snapped. Security already escorted you out once. But even as he said it, either guard moved. Not 1 inch. One of them had quietly lowered his radio. The other looked uncomfortable. Watching. Waiting. Richard noticed. His jaw flexed harder. Humiliation creeping under the surface now. Sir? The older investor interrupted carefully, stepping closer. Maybe we should hear her out. Richard turned sharply. You cannot be serious. She caught something none of us saw. That landed harder than expected. More eyes shifted toward Evelyn now. Respect. Curiosity. Dangerous things. Richard straightened his shoulders. Rebuilding himself. Billionaire posture. Control posture. Fine, he said coldly. You have 2 minutes. Evelyn nodded once. Calm. Unhurried. Your father came to me when Whitmore Industrial was drowning in debt, she said. Back when banks stopped returning his calls. Richard laughed immediately. Too fast. Too loud. That is impossible. But nobody laughed with him this time. Evelyn's gaze stayed locked on his. He walked into my office carrying coffee because he could not afford consultants. The sentence landed strangely. Human. Embarrassing. Real. Richard's face tightened. You are lying. Evelyn slowly removed one white glove. Her hands were older now, steady, elegant. She reached into the pocket of her staff apron. Pulled out something folded. Worn. Creased with age. The ballroom went still. She held it between 2 fingers. Then tell me, she said softly, why your father gave me this the night we saved your company. Richard stared at the object in her hand. His breath caught before he could stop it. Because even from several feet away, he recognized the handwriting on the front instantly. Thick blue ink. Messy. Familiar. One sentence written across the fold. To Evelyn. Thank you for saving my son's future. Richard stopped breathing. Richard Whitmore stared at the folded note like it had reached out and grabbed him by the throat. The ballroom felt smaller now. Hotter. Tighter. Crystal chandeliers burned overhead, throwing sharp reflections across polished silver trays and champagne glasses trembling in unsteady hands. Nobody spoke. Even the violinists had stopped. Somewhere near the back, a phone camera quietly zoomed in. Richard stepped forward slowly, disbelief tightening every line of his face. "Where did you get that?" he asked, voice lower now, rough around the edges. Evelyn did not flinch. "Your father handed it to me himself," she said calmly. "The night Whitmore Industrial stopped bleeding cash." A whisper moved through the crowd like static. One executive near the bar quietly muttered, "What is happening?" Richard held out his hand. "Give me the letter." Not a request. A command. Familiar billionaire tone. Control tone. Evelyn looked at the paper once, fingers resting lightly against its worn edges. Then she handed it over without hesitation. Richard unfolded it carefully. His pulse suddenly loud inside his ears. Thick blue ink. Same slanted handwriting. Same pressure marks from a pen pressed too hard. Henry Whitmore's handwriting. No question. No doubt. Richard read silently. Then stopped halfway through. His face shifted. Just slightly. Enough for everyone nearby to notice. "Richard," the older investor asked carefully, "is it real?" Richard did not answer. His jaw tightened. The paper trembled once in his hand before he folded it shut too quickly. "This proves nothing," he said sharply. Too sharply. Defensive. Immediate. The room reacted. Tiny glances. Raised eyebrows. Evelyn watched quietly. No anger. No satisfaction. Just patience. Dangerous patience. Richard straightened his jacket, rebuilding the version of himself he trusted most. The billionaire. The room commander. "You expect me to believe," he said louder now, "that a hotel maid somehow secretly saved my father's company?" A few uncomfortable chuckles surfaced. Weak ones. Forced. Nobody wanted to pick the wrong side anymore. Evelyn glanced toward the merger projections glowing blue across the ballroom wall. $43.8 million still hanging there like exposed wires. "No," she said softly. "I expect you to believe your father when he warned you not to trust Daniel Mercer." Silence. Immediate. Violent silence. Richard froze. Completely. Across the room, one executive actually dropped his phone. Daniel Mercer. Richard's chief financial officer. The architect of tomorrow's merger. Richard blinked once. Slow. Careful. "What did you just say?" Evelyn folded her gloves neatly into her palm. "Your father never trusted him." Richard laughed instantly. Reflex. Defensive again. "That is impossible." But something had changed. Sweat gathered faintly near his collar. Because Daniel Mercer had worked beside Richard for almost 12 years. Loyal. Brilliant. Untouchable. Daniel stepped forward now from the crowd, silver tie perfectly straight, expression unreadable. "Richard," he said carefully, calm as ever. "This is absurd." His voice cut through the tension like polished steel. Controlled. Professional. "You are really entertaining conspiracy theories from hotel staff?" The word staff landed hard. Intentional humiliation. Eyes shifted back toward Evelyn, waiting to see her crack. She did not. Daniel smiled politely. Dangerous smile. "If she knows so much," he added smoothly, "ask her something only someone from Whitmore would know." Richard turned back toward Evelyn, desperation beginning to creep beneath his pride now. "Fine," he said quietly. "One question." He stepped closer. Too close. "When my father died," his voice caught slightly before hardening again, "what were his last words to you?" The room stopped breathing. Phones lifted higher. Daniel crossed his arms. Waiting. Certain. Expecting her to fail. Evelyn looked at Richard for a long moment. Something softened in her expression. Sadness, maybe? Or memory? Then, quietly, almost too quietly to hear, she said, "He said?" Her eyes moved briefly toward Daniel. "Never let Mercer touch the books alone." Daniel's smile disappeared. Daniel Mercer's smile vanished so fast it looked painful. The ballroom air turned heavy, electric, like a storm pressing against glass. Nobody moved. Nobody even pretended to sip champagne anymore. Richard Whitmore stared between Evelyn and Daniel, his chest rising too quickly now, fingers tightening around the folded letter until the paper bent sharply at the corners. "That is not funny," Daniel said quietly, though something brittle had entered his voice. "Richard, this woman is manipulating you." Evelyn stayed still near the ballroom entrance, warm chandelier light catching the edge of her cheekbone, her staff apron suddenly looking absurd against the room full of million-dollar suits. "Am I?" she asked softly. Daniel took one slow step forward. Confident step. Control step. "Henry Whitmore died 11 years ago," he said calmly. "Nobody can verify a private conversation." He turned toward the investors, palms open now, polished executive mode returning. "We are letting a stranger derail a billion-dollar merger because she guessed one accounting irregularity." Several heads nodded. Relief flickered across a few faces. Familiar power felt. Safer. Predictable. Richard exhaled shakily. He wanted that version of reality. The simple one. The controllable one. But then Evelyn spoke again. Quietly. "Ask him about Phoenix." Daniel stopped moving. Completely. The silence cracked wider. Richard frowned immediately. "Phoenix?" Evelyn nodded once. "The internal project your father shut down after finding missing money." Daniel laughed too quickly. "There was no Phoenix project." Wrong move. Too fast. Too defensive. Richard's eyes narrowed. Because he remembered something now. A locked filing cabinet in his father's office. A faded label. Paychecks. Forgotten. Buried. Never explained. "Richard," Daniel said smoothly, recovering fast, "this is exactly how panic spreads." But sweat had started gathering beneath his collar now. Tiny things. Human things. "You are emotional because of your father." He lowered his voice carefully. "That makes you vulnerable." The word vulnerable landed hard. Richard hated that word. Across the room, investors exchanged increasingly nervous looks. One woman quietly opened her stock app. Another executive stepped away to take a call. Tiny fractures spreading everywhere. The giant merger screen still glowed overhead like a threat. $43.8 million. Missing. Real. Unavoidable. Richard looked back at Evelyn. Really looked this time. She had every reason to enjoy this. Every reason to humiliate him back. Instead, she looked tired. Concerned even. That unsettled him more than anger ever could. "If you know something," Richard said quietly, voice strained now, "say it." Daniel stepped in immediately. "No." Sharper than before. Several heads turned. Even Daniel seemed surprised by his own tone. He adjusted his cuffs slowly, forcing composure back into place. "This is not the time for theatrics." Evelyn's eyes stayed on Richard. "Tomorrow's merger is not the real problem," she said softly. "It is the distraction." Richard felt something cold settle into his stomach. "What are you talking about?" She glanced briefly toward Daniel. "Your father caught someone moving money through shell vendors years ago." Silence again. Brutal silence. "He stopped it," she continued. "Temporarily." Daniel's jaw tightened. Tiny muscle movement. Easy to miss. Impossible once seen. Richard swallowed hard. "You are saying someone has been stealing from my company?" Evelyn hesitated. For the first time. Like she wished she was wrong. "No," she said quietly. "I am saying someone may already own more of it than you realize." The room shifted. Audible gasps now. Phones lifting higher. Investors whispering faster. Daniel stepped forward again, voice colder now. Richard, he said firmly. This ends now. But before Richard could answer, a sharp sound suddenly cut through the ballroom. Beep. Then another. Beep. Beep. Every executive phone in the room lit up at once. Notifications. Urgent. One investor looked down first. Then froze. Another turned pale instantly. Someone whispered, horrified. No way. Richard pulled out his phone with trembling fingers. A headline filled the screen. Whitmore Technologies under federal accounting review. And beneath it, one name already trending online. Daniel Mercer. The ballroom did not erupt. It collapsed inward. Quietly. Horribly. The glow from hundreds of phone screens reflected across crystal glasses and polished silver like cold water spreading through cracks. Nobody spoke above a whisper now. The string quartet had stopped entirely. Somewhere near the ceiling vents, air hummed softly against the unbearable silence. Richard Whitmore stared at his phone without blinking. Federal Accounting Review. Daniel Mercer trending. The words looked unreal beneath the harsh white light of the screen. His fingers trembled once before tightening into a fist around the device. Across the room, Daniel stood perfectly still. Too still. His usual polished calm had thinned into something brittle. Dangerous. This is temporary, Daniel said finally, voice low, measured, almost too measured. Competitors leak false stories all the time. Nobody answered him. Not immediately. Investors stood frozen beneath chandeliers that suddenly felt too bright, too exposing. A woman near the bar quietly stepped away from Daniel. Another executive silenced his ringing phone without taking his eyes off him. Tiny movements. Tiny betrayals. Richard slowly lifted his head. His chest felt tight now. Heavy. Like the room had somehow become too small for oxygen. 11 years building this company. 11 years trusting the wrong man? His eyes moved toward Evelyn again. She had not touched her phone. Had not moved toward the crowd. Had not defended herself. She simply stood near the ballroom doors, hands folded, white gloves resting neatly against her palm, calm enough to unsettle everyone around her. The room had stopped seeing a maid. Nobody knew what they were seeing now. Richard noticed something strange then. Fear. Not in Evelyn. In everyone else. You knew this was coming, he said quietly. Not accusation anymore. Something closer to disbelief. Evelyn looked at him carefully. I hoped I was wrong. The answer landed harder than anger would have. Richard swallowed. Somewhere nearby, a phone vibrated softly against marble. Another headline notification. Another whisper. One investor quietly muttered. If regulators are involved, tomorrow is dead. Dead. The word echoed strangely inside Richard's chest. His merger. His reputation. His father's legacy. Slipping. Fast. Daniel stepped forward suddenly, shoes striking marble too sharply in the silence. Richard, he said firmly, you are panicking. He forced a small smile. Controlled smile. Familiar smile. This woman walks into a ballroom and suddenly your entire judgment disappears. Evelyn said nothing. That somehow made it worse. Richard looked between them again. Daniel. Trusted for 12 years. Evelyn. Humiliated publicly less than an hour ago, yet somehow every terrible thing she said had become true. You should leave, Daniel said coldly, finally turning toward Evelyn. The old power returning. Before this gets uglier. The sentence hung there. Sharp. Ugly. Familiar humiliation trying to reclaim the room. But nobody laughed this time. Nobody joined him. Even security stayed where they stood. Then Evelyn did something strange. She reached slowly into her apron pocket again. No drama. No performance. Just quiet certainty. She pulled out a small silver key. Old. Worn smooth from time. The metal caught cold chandelier light as several people leaned closer. Without realizing they had moved. Richard frowned immediately. Recognition flickered somewhere deep behind his eyes. Your father gave me this, Evelyn said softly. Told me never to use it unless everything went wrong. Nobody breathed. Even Daniel's posture changed. Small shift. Barely noticeable. But there. Evelyn looked directly at Richard now. For the first time all night, something heavier crossed her face. Not victory. Regret. There is a storage room beneath Whitmore Tower, she said quietly. Private archive level. Richard's pulse quickened. He had never heard of it. Inside, Evelyn continued, voice lower now. There is something your father wanted you to see only if Mercer ever betrayed you. Silence. Brutal silence. Daniel's face lost color. Just for a second. Long enough for Richard to notice. Then Daniel spoke too quickly. She is lying. Wrong move again. Richard looked at him. Really looked. The sweat near his collar. The tension in his jaw. The tiny crack forming beneath years of control. Then Richard turned back toward Evelyn. What is in the room? He asked quietly. Evelyn hesitated. Her fingers tightened slightly around the silver key. The truth, she said. Then, after a long pause that somehow made the room colder. And something your father never wanted Mercer to find. The ballroom stood suspended in silence. Not normal silence. The kind that pressed against your chest and made breathing feel louder than it should. Richard Whitmore stared at the silver key in Evelyn's hand like it had rewritten gravity itself. Somewhere near the back of the room, a phone camera adjusted focus with a tiny electronic click. Nobody lowered their devices anymore. Nobody wanted to miss whatever came next. Daniel Mercer recovered first. Or tried to. He straightened his tie slowly, forcing calm back into his face. Richard, he said, voice smooth again, practiced. Think carefully. She appears out of nowhere, manipulates emotions, drags your late father into this. He gestured lightly toward Evelyn. And suddenly she wants access to private company archives? Evelyn said nothing. That unsettled him more. Richard noticed. Tiny things suddenly looked different. Now. Daniel blinking too fast. His thumb tapping nervously against his watch band. Sweat gathering beneath the collar of a man who never sweated. The room noticed too. Investors exchanged glances. Quiet calculations already beginning. Then Evelyn finally stepped forward. One measured step against polished marble. Calm. Controlled. The same woman Richard had publicly humiliated less than an hour ago now somehow held the center of the entire room without raising her voice once. I do not want access, she said softly. It already belongs to you. Richard frowned. Then why did my father hide it? Evelyn's expression shifted slightly. Sadness. Old sadness. Because he knew trust could destroy dynasties. The sentence landed hard. Too hard. Daniel exhaled sharply. Enough. The word cracked through the ballroom louder than intended. Wrong move again. Several investors turned toward him immediately. Richard did too. Slowly now. Carefully. Why are you nervous? Richard asked quietly. Daniel froze for half a second. Tiny pause. Fatal pause. I am protecting the company, Daniel said. But the sentence came slower now. Less polished. Richard looked exhausted suddenly. Like someone waking up inside a nightmare halfway through. No, he said quietly. You are protecting something. The room shifted again. Nobody stood beside Daniel anymore. Literally. People had begun creating distance without realizing it. Half steps backward. Tiny spaces opening around him. Isolation happening in real time. Evelyn glanced toward the giant merger projection glowing across the ballroom wall. $43.8 million. Missing. Your father knew Mercer would wait, she said calmly. Wait until enough people trusted him. Richard's pulse pounded harder. Wait for what? Evelyn hesitated. Then quietly. Control. A low murmur spread through the room. Shocked. Uneasy. Daniel laughed suddenly. Sharp laugh. Defensive laugh. This is insane. But even he did not sound convinced anymore. Then Evelyn reached into her apron pocket one last time. Slow movement. Careful movement. Every phone in the room tilted upward. Richard stopped breathing. She placed a folded envelope gently on the nearest table. Yellowed edges. Old paper. Sealed. Henry Whitmore's handwriting across the front. Richard. Open only if Evelyn brings you here. Nobody moved. Even Daniel looked stunned now. Real stunned. Richard stepped closer, fingers shaking visibly for the first time in years. You kept this? He asked quietly. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Your father made me promise. Richard swallowed hard. His expensive suit suddenly looked too heavy on him. Too sharp for the grief sitting quietly behind his eyes. Why? He whispered. Evelyn's voice softened. Because he believed one day. She paused, eyes flicking briefly toward Daniel. You would need help seeing who truly stood beside you. The sentence shattered something invisible inside Richard. He looked around the ballroom. Investors whispering. Executives avoiding eye contact. Daniel standing alone now beneath cold chandelier light. Then Richard slowly reached for the envelope. The room held its breath. Daniel stepped forward instantly. Too quickly. Richard, he said sharply, panic finally slipping through. Do not open that. Silence. Complete silence. Richard stopped mid-motion. Slowly turned toward Daniel. And for the first time all night, fear sat plainly on Daniel Mercer's face. Daniel Mercer's fear changed the room. It spread quietly, invisibly, through the ballroom like smoke no one could escape. Richard Whitmore stood frozen with his hand hovering inches above the envelope, breathing slower now, heavier. The chandeliers reflected cold streaks of light across his face, catching the exhaustion settling beneath his eyes. Daniel had never looked afraid before. Not once in 12 years. And somehow, that frightened Richard more than the headlines. Richard, Daniel said again, softer now, almost pleading. Do not do this here. Wrong choice of words. Here. Not do not open it. Not this is fake. Just not here. Richard noticed. So did everyone else. Around the ballroom, investors lowered their phones slightly, no longer watching Evelyn with curiosity. They were watching Daniel now. Measuring him. Recalculating him. The room had shifted completely. Evelyn remained near the ballroom entrance still. Wearing the same plain uniform Richard had mocked earlier. Same white gloves folded neatly in her hand. Same calm posture. Yet somehow the room bent toward her now without her asking it to. Respect had arrived quietly. No announcement. No performance. Just truth catching up. Richard finally picked up the envelope. His fingers shook once. Tiny tremor. Human tremor. Henry Whitmore's handwriting looked painfully familiar under the ballroom lights. He broke the seal slowly. Nobody moved. Even the air felt still. Somewhere in the distance, an ice machine hummed softly from the hotel kitchen. Richard unfolded the paper. His father's voice arrived through ink instantly. Richard. If Evelyn has brought this to you, then I was right to fear what comes next. Trust her before you trust anyone else in this room. Richard stopped breathing for half a second. The crowd leaned closer unconsciously. Daniel looked pale now. Truly pale. Richard kept reading silently, jaw tightening with every line. Then his expression changed. Not anger first. Hurt. Deep hurt. Old hurt. His father had known. Years ago. He had known something terrible was coming. And he had trusted Evelyn to protect a future Richard himself had nearly destroyed tonight. Richard lowered the letter slowly. His throat moved once before he finally looked up. Straight at Evelyn. The ballroom disappeared around him for a second. Just her standing there under warm chandelier light, quiet and steady while everyone else fractured under pressure. Why did you come tonight? He asked quietly. No billionaire tone anymore. No performance. Just exhaustion. Evelyn hesitated. For the first time all evening, emotion crossed her face. Small. Almost invisible. Because your father asked me to promise, she said softly. And because I could not watch another Whitmore lose everything. The sentence landed hard. Harder than humiliation ever could. Richard looked down for a moment. Really down. At the polished marble floor. At the memory of champagne dripping from his jacket while he mocked her in front of everyone. People like you should stay invisible. The words returned now like something rotten. Shame moved through him slowly. Heavy. Public. Real. Around the ballroom, something else shifted too. Investors who had ignored Evelyn now looked openly stunned. One older woman near the front quietly whispered. She tried to save him. Another executive lowered his phone completely. Even security stood straighter somehow. Richard finally took one slow step toward Evelyn. Then another. The room watched every second of it. Phones recording. Breaths held. He stopped in front of her, close enough now to see the tiredness beneath her calm. I was wrong, he said quietly. The sentence barely above a whisper. But in the silence, everyone heard it. Richard Whitmore did not apologize publicly. Ever. Yet here he stood, stripped of certainty, stripped of pride. I judged you, he continued, voice rough now. I humiliated you. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Then gently shook her head once. You were scared, she said softly. No anger. No victory. Somehow that made the shame worse. Richard exhaled shakily. Across the room, Daniel slowly took one careful step backward toward the exit. Tiny movement. Quiet movement. Almost invisible. But Evelyn noticed first. Her eyes shifted past Richard. Just briefly. Then something colder entered her expression. Calm again. Controlled again. Richard, she said quietly. If Mercer leaves this room, her voice lowered just enough to freeze the air again, you may never find what your father hid beneath the tower. Daniel Mercer stopped moving. Just for a second. But everyone saw it. The tiny hesitation. The flicker of panic crossing a face that had looked untouchable for 12 years. The ballroom held its breath again, though this time the silence felt different. Less fear. More certainty. Richard Whitmore turned slowly. No rush now. No anger. Just something colder. Something quieter. Daniel, he said softly, almost tired. Do not leave. Daniel forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. Richard, this is absurd. We should handle this privately. But nobody believed private anymore. Not after the headlines. Not after the letter. Around the ballroom, phones lowered one by one. Investors no longer looked entertained. They looked embarrassed. Ashamed even. Because less than 2 hours ago, they had laughed while a woman in a staff uniform stood alone under ballroom lights and absorbed humiliation without raising her voice. Richard looked back at Evelyn. Really looked. The white gloves folded carefully in her hands. The calm in her posture. The dignity she somehow never dropped, even after he tried to make her disappear. He remembered the words he had thrown at her. People like you should stay invisible. Shame settled deeper this time. Heavy. Honest. Security, Richard said quietly. Not loud. Just final. 2 guards stepped forward immediately, but not toward Evelyn. Toward Daniel. The room shifted with them. Daniel's expression hardened instantly. You are making a mistake, he snapped. But the authority had left his voice. One guard gently held out a hand toward the ballroom lounge. Sir? Daniel looked around, searching for allies. Nobody moved. Nobody defended him. One board member looked away completely. Another slowly removed Daniel's name from a call screen without saying a word. Isolation had arrived. Quietly. Permanently. Then Daniel stopped near the ballroom doors and turned once more toward Richard. Ask her what she gave up, he said coldly, eyes flicking toward Evelyn. Ask why someone like her ended up carrying trays in a hotel. The sentence landed. Sharp. Ugly. Last attempt at humiliation. The room tensed again. Richard turned toward Evelyn slowly. He hated himself for wondering. But before he could speak, Evelyn answered. Calmly. I stepped away, she said softly. After your father passed. Her eyes moved briefly toward the letter still trembling slightly in Richard's hand. There are things more important than titles. No speech. No bitterness. Just truth. The kind that made noise feel unnecessary. Richard swallowed hard. For years he had chased bigger deals, larger rooms, louder applause. Yet somehow the strongest person in the room had been the woman everyone ignored. The woman he mocked. Somewhere near the ballroom windows, dawn had begun pressing softly against the glass. Pale morning light slipped into the edges of the room, cooling the gold from the chandeliers. The crisis had not disappeared. Federal investigators would come. Headlines would spread. Tomorrow would hurt. But something deeper had changed. Richard stepped closer to Evelyn one final time. The room watched without speaking. Then, quietly, in front of everyone who had laughed with him, Richard reached for the empty chair nearest the head investor table. The seat reserved beside him. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled it out. For her. Nobody said a word. Nobody needed to. Evelyn hesitated for just a moment before setting her folded gloves gently on the polished table. White fabric beside billion-dollar contracts. Dignity beside power. Richard lowered his eyes briefly. Would you stay? He asked quietly. No command now. No ego. Just humility. Evelyn looked toward the morning light gathering across the ballroom windows. Then back at him. A small smile touched her face. Tired. Gentle. For your father, she said softly. And for the company he tried to protect. Around them, phones finally lowered. Investors stood quieter than before. Changed somehow. Because nobody in that room would ever forget what they had witnessed. The woman they tried not to see had become the only person everyone trusted. And as sunlight slowly replaced chandelier light across the marble floor, Richard Whitmore quietly placed a fresh cup of coffee beside Evelyn's chair before taking his own seat, saying nothing at all.